Is it good? Can you hear me?
I hear you just fine.
You can hear me. Oh, I know why, because I don't have my thing on. That's stupid. Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. We had looked at rescheduling, but we're going to go ahead and do it now. We have 50 wonderful followers online and 8 or 10 here in the hall. And next door, people are drinking. They're getting rewilded next door. So I'm Vance Martin. I'm president of the Wild Foundation, and in the WCPA, the chair of the Wilderness Specialist Group, co-chair, I should say, with a very active group of wilderness professionals. Our topic today is rewilding, the Global Rewilding Alliance, and animating the carbon cycle, all parts of rewilding. And I'm just going to give a little bit of background on what this is, what the Global Rewilding Alliance is, and then Amy Lewis, Wild's Vice President for Communications and Policy, is going to carry the main show, and then we'll have a little discussion for who's ever here or online. So we were planning the 11th World Wilderness Congress in India for March of last year. Great timing. We, after 2.5 years of planning, we canceled it 2 weeks before it convened because of course, the pandemic. And but the planning had gone so far that we had a number of outcomes already to be produced. And one of those was the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth. And so we finished that with the committee. We posted it, got a huge response, very significant positive response, because rewilding is something that's becoming very popular now. It's different from restoration. We'll talk about that when Amy makes her presentation. And so out of that global charter, there was a call to form an alliance of the many groups around the world, all ages, all countries. So with very little solicitation, people began to gather, and the Global Rewilding Alliance was started. It was recognized very quickly by the UN Decade on Restoration. And right now, the alliance stands at about 130 members, all continents except Antarctica, working on plus or minus all of the organizations. I think now it's 100 million hectares of land and sea. Doing various types of rewilding, because rewilding is very specific. There's no one size fits all to rewilding. It depends on place, culture, history, soil, habitat. And that's the really wonderful thing about it, is that what we're doing is we're mimicking wilderness coming back. So with that little introduction, I'm going to hand over to Amy, and she's going to do a lot better job than I could do. So, Amy.
Don't be ridiculous, Vance. I just want to thank everybody for being here, looking out into the audience, seeing both old and new friends, and what an honor and privilege to speak to you today about something that I'm very passionate about, and that I hope that you'll join me in that passion. So, many of you may have heard of this new term, rewilding, this year. And if you did, you weren't the only ones. On March 20th of this year, it was the first Global Rewilding Day. That would be the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere, the fall equinox in the southern hemisphere. We chose that date because we wanted to invoke balance, which we see wilderness and wildness as. And on Rewilding Day, we launched the Global Rewilding Alliance, and we were able to reach millions and millions of people with this message of rewilding. And we did this in partnership with Rewild, with One Earth, with Rewilding Britain, and 150 other groups. So we were joined in this effort with a truly international coalition. And I want to share with you, before I get into the meat of this presentation, I want to share with you the video that we shared with the world, if it would play. There we go. Okay, thank you.
Time is running out for nature, for our climate.
Oh, I'm
for our
sorry. This is the
communities.
wrong video. Hold on. This was not the video we shared. Hang on.
Can I help?
I think I figured out the.
Who's that? No, these are ads.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's skip the video for now. You can view it on Wild Foundation's YouTube, and anyway, so let's get into what is the difference between rewilding and restoration. Rewilding is an action where we give the land back to wildness, back to wilderness, and I'm going to get into the specifics of what that means and how it differs from restoration. But I want you to keep in mind that restoration is a little bit different. Restoration is where we are restoring the land to values that it once had and that we ourselves prioritize in that landscape. So there's a crucial difference there, and it's going to guide us in our understanding of this Rewilding Alliance and what it's attempting to accomplish. So on the screen behind me are examples, and I want to make sure everyone can see this, examples of what a rewilded landscape may look like versus what a restored landscape looks like. And as you can see, there is perhaps what we would identify as a little bit more structure to the process of restoring, whereas the rewilded landscape, I mean, it looks pretty gnarly. So, in order to understand rewilding, I think we first need to conceptualize wilderness and what wilderness is and why it's valuable. The fact is that life comes from wilderness, that for the last 400, 500 million years, our planet has grown life, has nurtured life through wild processes and entirely in the wilderness. So, wilderness is in fact how nature innovates. Wilderness is how nature adapts and mitigates new and emerging processes and conditions. The reason why wilderness and rewilding may be a useful tool for us in this day and age is that wilderness effortlessly adapts to a changing world. There have been numerous changes in our planet for the last couple 100 million years. And all the while, wilderness has adapted to support a healthy and vibrant biosphere. In fact, wilderness also doesn't just adapt, it mitigates change in the world. Wilderness, I think, is one of the critical conditions of a resilient system, because in that system, you have natural processes with natural inertia. And over time, that inertia is what ultimately helps absorb change and allow the system to rebound from change. So, what then, where is the wilderness in our world? What does it look like? How wild is our planet really? Well, if you look at this map, and this comes from Watson et al. A couple of years ago. If you look at this map, you'll see that the dark blue areas are the wild areas. That's what remains as wilderness. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only places where nature has value, right? Around these areas, there's numerous shared lands where natural ecological systems are still intact. And you still have nature and you still have wild animals in those areas. But in these dark blue areas, we're really looking at relatively untouched nature in a kind of pristine-ish form. Those dark blue areas only make up about 25 or 26% of our planet. So while nature may be intact in a little over half of our planet right now, it's about a quarter of our planet that remains as wild. The challenge then is, for us, I think we're all aware of this by now, but the challenge is, how do we mitigate the harmful effects of the changes that are upon us? The climate emergency, mass extinction, the increased frequency of pandemics, and adapt to this changing world for the benefit of life and the continuation of human civilization. And if we're thinking about what wilderness does, what its power is, we might think of it as our most important ally in the changes and adaptations that are coming. One of the things that several groups have kind of come to independently of each other is the importance of 350 million hectares. We see this in the Bond Challenge. We see it in a couple of other papers, that if we're able to restore or rewild 350 million hectares, we're going to go a long way towards adapting to climate change and also providing the ecological services that some of the most vulnerable communities need. What does 350 million hectares mean? Well, it turns out 350 million hectares is less than 1% of the surface of the Earth. And if we're able to rewild this, and a caveat here, it does have to be 350 million of the right hectares. Okay, we're looking at really high value carbon sequestration landscapes. If we're able to rewild 350 million of these hectares, we can actually reduce the amount of excess carbon in the atmosphere by 37%. Removing a significant portion of that carbon will slow climate change and give us a chance to stabilize the emergency we're in right now. So I want to get back to the question of rewilding versus restoration. Let's think about this in terms of outcome, because rewilding has a little bit of a different, we have to change our expectations a little bit with rewilding. Rewilding essentially is returning the land to the wild and improving its capacity to evolve. We're essentially allowing nature to follow its destiny, and not to get too anthropomorphizing here. I don't think that's a word, but I just invented it. We need to allow nature the ability to determine its own destiny, giving it a chance to find the adaptations it needs to survive and thrive. That means letting go of some of our own expectations about the landscape. That means that we're not necessarily controlling the outcome entirely or the values of that landscape entirely. We're letting nature do its thing. Restoration, on the other hand, is changing the landscape, restoring a degraded and mismanaged landscape to a place where we've fixed it and it now has unchanging qualities, or we're going to try to manage those qualities so that they remain present there. Neither of these approaches one is not better than the other, okay? Rewilding is a tool we can use in a lot of different circumstances, especially in places where maybe there's lower capacity to manage and to maintain certain values in the landscape. Restoration is another tool we can utilize for other types of landscapes in other types of situations. And just to be clear, the Rewilding Network utilizes both. We encourage both. We may be advocating for rewilding and advocating for wildness and wilderness, but we're also pragmatic in our approach. So as Vance mentioned, the Global Rewilding Alliance began this year as a kind of final outcome of the 11th World Wilderness Congress and the Global Rewilding Charter. We have since recruited over close to 200 members around the world. We are looking for more, and we are currently in the process of, okay, we're gonna get back to that. We're currently in the process of animating the carbon cycle, bringing wilderness and wildness into this idea of climate change and our solutions for it. Animating the carbon cycle right now is in its first phase, where we're collecting research and looking at what types of species, what types of interventions are going to be most appropriate to address climate change with rewilding and wilderness. But once we finish this phase and publish the results, it has the potential to become a blueprint for coordinated action amongst hundreds of NGOs around the world to help create a wilder, healthier, and more balanced planet. Other things that the other projects and actions that the Rewilding Alliance is in the process of creating is global education and advocacy around wilderness. I think oftentimes we forget that good solutions don't just sell themselves. In fact, some of the best solutions for a very, very long time struggled to be able to take hold in society. For some reason, the example that comes to mind is of, it comes from the 19th century, is a doctor named Semmelweis. And Semmelweis basically observed that when he washed his hands during, right before delivering a baby, that the mother and the child were less likely to die after delivery. And he wrote a couple of papers about this, recommending, not knowing why, but recommending that doctors start washing their hands. He was laughed at. In fact, he died a pauper on the streets because his profession ridiculed him for coming up with such a simple-minded solution. It wasn't until microscopes became widely used and people could observe bacteria and understood what bacteria did that they realized why Semmelweis was advocating for washing hands. So good solutions don't just sell themselves. They require advocates. And for the Global Rewilding Alliance is the advocate for rewilding and for situating this type of action inside policy networks and policy solutions. Here's a nice little diagram of what we mean by rewilding the climate cycle. As you can see, CO2 goes down into the atmosphere. Some animals intervene, helping the landscape absorb more CO2, and we have a virtuous cycle. Other education and advocacy efforts include animating the carbon cycle and creating a blueprint for action around a wilder, a healthier, carbon-neutral planet. And also knowledge sharing. Many NGOs around the world struggle with keeping informed, with finding the best case studies on an efficient time scale. And you know, time is not on our side right now. The faster that we can figure out effective solutions and implement them, the better off we're going to be. So the Global Rewilding Alliance will act as an accelerator for the distribution and sharing of knowledge, its uptake, and its implementation. The Global Rewilding Alliance is completely committed to not just working in partnership with Indigenous groups, but also Indigenous leadership. The fact is that Indigenous communities have been stewarding the land successfully and its biodiversity for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And looking at their life ways and their cultural knowledge might help us devise better solutions as well. So this is absolutely a key principle of the Global Rewilding Alliance. Now, if you visit our website, that would be rewildingglobal.org, you will find a list of our many distinguished partners that are there. I'm highlighting only a couple of them here because this slide didn't have infinite space. As you can see, Rewild and the Wild Foundation are the co-founders of the Global Rewilding Alliance. And some of our other main supporters include Tompkins Conservation, Sanctuary Asia, the Wildlife Conservation Trust of India, and Rewilding Europe and others. So that is the conclusion of this presentation on rewilding. I thank you so much for your attention, and Vance and I welcome any questions you may have about the Global Rewilding Alliance.
Okay, it should be on. There we are. Thanks, Amy. Just wanted to add something before we open the floor. Animating the Carbon Cycle was a concept, scholarly concept developed by Professor Oswald Schmitz at Yale. First published, I believe, 2014. What it does for the first time is it shows the impact mainly of wildlife on land and sea on the carbon cycle. And it goes into research that had never been done before, but very obvious. Some of you may have seen the very famous TED Talk by our friends in Sri Lanka on whale poop, right? It's the same kind of thing. Yeah, couldn't remember. And so what we found is that we started to work with Professor Schmitz about a year ago and began to just circulate the concept. And surprising to all of us was how little it's known. Everybody talks about carbon takedown and tailpipes and all of this kind of stuff. But what Professor Schmitz and others, Steve Lutz at Grid Arendal, they're taking the research and showing that by rewilding, especially with mammals and fish, we can draw down more carbon, reduce the amount of tree planting, right? I think we all know how simple kind of concept tree planting is. I mean, I prefer forests to trees. So it's really that concept, and I really want to honor Oz Schmitz because he's a pioneer, and he's bringing information up which is as obvious as the nose on our face, but yet it's not well known or yet deployed. So thank you, Oz. If you're listening, thank you. Really cool concept. Any comments? Anything? Questions? Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you, first of all, for your outstanding work. It's so important. I just have one question. So you showed the map, and what I see coming from an ocean conservation perspective is the fact that in some way, even in this map, the pristine area of the sea are not shown. Mm-hmm. So I wanted just to ask you how much the marine component is taken into consideration in the data that you highlighted in your presentation, and how much, for example, we know that for the carbon cycle, the ocean play like
Sure.
an outstanding role, especially ecosystem like seagrasses, mangrove forest, and all the stuff like that. So I would like to ask you more about this.
Well, Marisol, as always, you're exactly on timing, because in the last 2 months we're developing that whole component.
Perfect.
And we're gathering more groups. This was the easiest thing to do to get things started. And what we're finding now is that in the marine world, there are lots of micro projects. Just as there are in, like say, urban areas, people are rewilding parks or whatever. We're finding in the marine world thousands, literally thousands of micro projects working in a lagoon or in a harbor. So yeah, that we expect to roll that out. We have a working group in about 3 weeks, I think. And the really, and this is going to play right into a project that we've got going now with One Earth and Rewild and a special core group. We're actually going to be producing the handbook on the impact of animating the carbon cycle and rewilding on climate change. All the standard texts right now still deal with emissions and tailpipes. So we'll be producing the complementary text on nature-based solutions.
And on a related note too, in terms of the map, we're using a map from Watson et al. From a few years ago, and as many of you know, the marine mapping lags behind terrestrial because of the complexity involved, the flow, etc. So, but just know that our eyes are on that, and we're looking at including that as well, as Vance has amply covered.
I'm just going to do a quick comment on that and then ask another question. I don't want to take the floor from others, but I think it's useful, the second question, for everyone here listening that might be interested in joining. One small comment is I think that rewilding really applies to the marine environment, more than restoration, because it's much harder, to restore the marine environment, and it's much easier to just leave it alone and let it exercise the outstanding power that nature and the ocean has to recover, So this was just a comment, and I think it's very important to consider.
No, I think you're very right, because we all know that marine environments are much more dynamic.
Yes.
And we all know the results of no-take zones. Essentially, that's a form of rewilding.
Exactly.
Period.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because it's much harder to do restoration. My question, which I think it's useful, how we can join? Mm-hmm. What is the process and how we can contribute, for example, as from an NGO perspective?
So Magnus Sylvan and Carl Wagner are the co-directors of the Rewilding Alliance, and speaking with Magnus directly is the best way to join, and he prefers it that way. So I would encourage you to go to rewildingglobal.org. And you can read about it on the website. You can sign up for newsletters and updates. That's all there. But in order to actually apply, you'll need to speak with Magnus, and his email is magnus@wild.org. That's magnus@wild.org.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your presentation. It was definitely among the most interesting presentation I had. My question follows...
That's very kind of you. Because there are a ton of interesting presentations here, let me tell you.
My question is more technical and follows with Maria Sole's question. Do you have any kind of a list of criteria that will be useful to understand what areas are eligible to be selected as for the process of wildering?
So I'm going to pass this to Vance to answer that, but I want you to also know, because of the early age of this alliance, we are in the process of working with our hundreds of stakeholders in order to develop those criteria. Right now, the most important thing for us is a willingness to rewild, as well as some ecological criteria. But Vance can get more into the specifics of that.
Yeah, the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth, online, it's been peer-reviewed and published as well. It's also on the rewildingglobal.org website. That has 10 principles. These are principles about what rewilding is, okay? The Rewilding Task Force of the Commission on Ecosystem Management is producing, Steve Carver and his very large team, they're producing more of the practitioner's guide, right? So I think that paper, I should know this, I think that paper has just been published. I believe it's on our website now. It's brand new. So that, there's the charter, and that has more of the principles. But then for practitioners, as to what type of rewilding where, would be Carver et al. And I think it is, check with Commission on Ecosystem Management. Steve, if you're listening, you're going to kill me because I should have known this. Thank you.
Hello. May I ask the question also? How we can rewild the areas like the palm oil plantations in Malaysia or Indonesia, and for instance the parts of the Amazonian in Brazil, when we know that for some countries these are the basic economic parameters and basic sources of income. So is there any strategy for that, and do you think that do we need to pay somehow to contribute to these economies for these basic ecosystem services, which is which is well-being for all countries and humanity?
Yeah, there was a couple of comments or a couple of questions there. I'll just take one. Don't get me started on palm oil. Thank you very much. Should there be budgeting for restoration and rewilding? Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the big goals of the UN decade on restoration. So as we roll forward, there's not, when you, I think everybody knows these figures, but when you look at how much money is required for carbon drawdown through rewilded areas compared to money spent on other things, it's actually a very small amount. It's really a matter of changing people's mindset. Everybody here knows about nature, and it's all very cool and very, it kind of makes sense. But policymakers don't operate like that. Look at the issues we have right now with simply trying to protect enough of the earth as it is. People are quibbling about 17%, 20%. Should we go to a third? No, we should go to a half. So, I mean, that's what we're dealing with here. So, should there be a budget? Absolutely. Fight for it. We need it. Amy.
So conveniently, we happen to be on the page of the Global Rewilding Charter that talks about building local economies. And I know this isn't going to be easy because this does require policy shifts. It does require consensus building and all of those things that I think most of us are kind of terrified to do. But the World Economic Forum just last year posted the fact that if we shift to a nature restoration economy versus a nature exploitation economy, we can add nearly 400 million jobs in the next 10 years. We can add hundreds of billions of dollars to economies. So there are ways that we can shift into restoration and rewilding and simultaneously maintain and grow the livelihoods of local communities and the economies that depend on that. So I want to address that. Another thing, and I think is interesting, and totally, I mean, these questions are not easy, so I'm not trying to gloss over them, and I appreciate you really getting to the challenging part. There's another paper written by somebody in another network that Wild stewards, and that's the Nature Needs Half Network. And his name is Harvey Locke. He wrote this with several other authors, but it's called the 3 Conditions Approach to Protecting Half of Earth. And he basically takes a map and is able to identify the high-quality wilderness areas that we had up here, the shared lands, and then also the degraded lands, the cities and the farms and whatnot, and say, you know, we need 3 different strategies, economic, political, and ecological, in each of these areas. We need to protect the best and rewild the rest. In those pristine areas and in the shared lands. We need to promote policies that allow for ecological functionality in shared lands while also allowing the people who live in those areas to continue to support their own livelihoods. And then we need to work on reducing consumption, reducing production in cities so that we can support the rest. So there are many folks working on this, and thank you very much for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Vance. Just reflecting on what you asked, I'm one of the co-authors of this rewilding paper, which is indeed up now, available. Also on the IUCN website, there is an issue brief about rewilding now, and we are working currently on case studies to show how this could work in practice. We have a European case study from Poland, for instance, that we worked out. And what I wanted to say is that the task force is now going to turn into a working group as well, which is going to be a bigger working group within IUCN. Yeah? So these are important notes.
I've been told we need to kind of close this down, but before we go, I just want to say, sir, I like your tattoo. I happen to have one as well.
Thanks a lot, everybody.